Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this new episode of the virtual DDD meetup, or for some it's good morning, or some it's good afternoon. For us, it's good evening. For some, it's yesterday. Welcome to this new episode called How to Improve Modeling with Behavior Driven Development. With me today is Steve, Matt, and Seb. So, who would like to introduce himself first?
I'd like to introduce Matt. Matt is the person who wrote the influential Cucumber book with Aslak Household, and also the even more, I think, possibly influential Introducing Example Mapping, a technique which, I don't know, we don't call it creative, do we? That you discovered by having a pack of 4 colored cards in your pocket one day when consulting with some clients.
Yeah, and who doesn't? I mean, most people have found themselves in that position, haven't they? Okay, thanks, Seb. How about I introduce Steve then? I met Steve at a software craftsmanship conference at Bletchley Park thousands of years ago, and I was stuck because I couldn't make some sort of networking thing work, and I had a room of like 60 craft people who were all filing in and about to start using my thing, and something wasn't working, and Steve helped. And we became friends, and eventually he joined. We spent about 3 years hacking on the internals of Cucumber Ruby part-time on Fridays and changing it over to a sort of tell, don't ask style design, which is kind of really given birth to the design that's in all of the other Cucumbers nowadays. And now, weirdly, Steve works as a product manager. Is that right? Is that what you call yourself?
That is the term that is commonly used right now. Yeah. So thanks, Matt. I can try and introduce Seb. Seb is, like all of us, one of the co-founders of Cucumber Limited. He won't like this, but he's kind of like the elder statesman of the group, and keeps us all in check with sense and good ideas. Seb took the Cucumber book that he mentioned that Matt and Aslak wrote initially, and he turned it into a Cucumber for Java book. And he took many of the ideas that, like example mapping and the way we've been talking to people about how to do BDD for a long time, and turned them into an excellent training course, which Cucumber Limited has been selling or delivering with people for a long time now. And yeah, that's Seb.
Great. So anyone has something to add to their own introduction so far? Good. So let's start. Cucumber got founded, but how long ago?
Well, the open source project started in 2008.
Mm-hmm. And what was the inspiration there? Obviously BDD, but
I'm telling someone else's story here. I mean, the name was, and it was inspired by Aslak's wife, Patty, who was eating a sandwich at the time. I think that might have had cucumbers in it. But
that's apocryphal. That's apocryphal.
Aslak says that's not true.
Oh, okay. Sometimes he tells a story like that. But she just, anyway. It was an offhand comment that is from where the name came from. But I know Aslak well, he was working on the RSpec project at the time, and there was a thing that Dan North had created within RSpec called the RSpec Story Runner, and the technology was a bit ropey, and Aslak decided to rewrite it as a standalone project, standalone library. And I know he was working at the time in like doing a lot of work with requirements documents and finding it really frustrating. I think, as quite a lot of us were at the time, that it was really difficult to execute your requirements documents. You know, there wasn't a good way to sort of bridge between the documents your users wanted to read and write, or your customers wanted to read and write, and the automated tests that we were able to create and write ourselves. And, you know, you couldn't show them the tests, and you didn't particularly like reading their documents. And so I think Aslak had the idea, or that group of people had the idea, to try and create something that was both.
Okay. And so I've been introduced by it by a blog post by Paul Reiner, and obviously before I use it mostly in a given when then thing, right? As I think most people talk now about given when then, which is BDD. But perhaps, as we said before, to already debunk some myths, right? People think BDD is all about test automation, and maybe Cucumber has something to play in there, but can anyone go into that shortly? Hopefully most people know, but just to get on the same baseline, what for you is the most interesting part of BDD?
Most interesting. Well, we got
what's the most powerful part of it?
Well, I mean, for me, it's having a way of collaborating with non-technical folk. As Steve so wonderfully pointed out in the introduction, I've been in this game for quite a long time, and I've spent a lot of time as a developer trying to implement things that have been poorly thought out, with massive sets of assumptions that were never surfaced, with people in different buildings, different continents, different rooms, trying to think about what developers need to know and give you the information, only to find out that they haven't given you the right information. You've no idea what you're supposed to do. And so for me, the joy of behavior driven development is being able to collaborate with those product folk and write specifications that they can understand and we can understand, and write that collaboratively. So it's not having testers write stuff, it's not having developers write stuff, it's not having product people write stuff, it's writing it together. And the game changer of both Fit and Fitness, which is one of the guys Eric has just asked about that on the chat, and Cucumber, the Gherkin format, they both allow you to have that collaborative discussion, because it's in a format that doesn't really need any low-level knowledge. It gives you it's there for everyone on the team to work with.
Yeah, so that's one of the most biggest myths I usually see when I go into developers is they're writing these Cucumber specs in isolation and then just create test automation, right? So is that something you still see a lot these days?
Yeah, all the time. But it's also the thing is, I mean, right, we know so many people, most people who are writing software and writing automated tests for that software are doing it backwards, right? Almost all of them are writing the tests after they've written the code, which those of us who've done TDD know is generally a pretty crap way to do test automation. And they're missing out on so many benefits. And this is really the magic thing for me. It's like, if I sit down to do a side project, I'm still going to use Cucumber almost every time, because there's something really amazing about trying to explain in plain English or plain whatever your language is, because you can write Cucumber specs in like 50 different spoken languages. If you sit down and try and explain to the computer what you want your program to do, it really, really helps you to sharply think about what you really want it to do. And that is the really powerful bit. But of course, if you're writing that after the fact, when you've already think you've figured out what you want the program to do, you don't learn nearly as much in the act of sitting and writing it down. You don't have those aha moments before you've gone and written all the code.
Yeah, so I guess you're falling into a bias there, right? You're just confirming to what your belief is already telling you if you do it afterwards, right? Like if you do it up front, and I did some training from the back of the room, they say talking is better than listening. Like if you write it down the way you say it, you probably know it's sometimes, this doesn't make sense. Maybe change it.
Yeah. And that idea about talking is better than listening. And they also say, Sharon Bowman says, writing is better than reading as well. And we will try and encourage teams when they collaborate. And this is a kind of counterintuitive thing, that if you're going to sort of separate who writes those given when thens from who reads them and reviews them, assuming you're doing this before the development work starts, another kind of mistaken assumption a lot of people can think of is like, this is just a new format for us to write specification documents in. So now we just have to train all the business analysts into how to shoehorn every requirement they have into this given when then shape. And then they just write all their requirements down as given when then examples. And that's absolutely the wrong way to do it, because you're not going to learn as much doing it that way as you would if you have a conversation between the business analyst and say the developer, or the developer and the QA person. And then they try and write down what it was they think they understood, and go and show that back to the business analyst and say, here, this is it's like the minutes of the meeting. Here are some examples that I think reflect what we just spoke about. What do you think? Is this right? And it's really cheap. Like, you can do this in a few minutes, just write some examples down, and then it's really easy to test your understanding. But again, you can't do that if you've already written the code, because it's too late, right? Like, I mean, if you did show the business analyst and said, this is what I thought you wanted me to make it do, and I've just spent 2 weeks writing all the code, you're going to cry, aren't you, if they then tell you it's wrong?
Yeah, and that also relates to a bit of modeling, where we go in later. A thing here, Rebecca says, it reminds her of the original goal of literate programming, to explain to the computer and others who care what you would like to achieve.
Yes, literate programming. That's the thing where you write programs in a literate. I don't know what that means. I have to go and look that up.
I think it was
Give my ignorance, Rebecca.
Knut. But I think it's between your lines of code. So people say nowadays is your code should make sense. So that's your documentation. While literate programming also writes down the reason why you came up with certain decisions in your code. So it uses a lot of documentation, as far as I know. Okay, Rebecca reminds me, it's your thinking. It's not documentation. It's a reason and examples. Yeah.
Well, so this is the thing. I would like. Matt started talking about examples, and Rebecca's brought examples into it. And I think that was the key thing when I was using Fit, that it was the examples that we were using that became that currency with which we would start to go back and forth and talk with the product owners or business analysts, the customer on the team in those days. And it's those examples that really going back to your first question, like, they're the key thing about BDD for me. It's like bringing examples to the front as the way that we discuss what we want the software to do. So we often talk about behavior that we want to see in the system, but until we make that real by having an example and saying, well, what happens in this instance, that's when we really start to understand what it is we want it to do.
Yeah. And one thing there is, in BDD, they also talk a lot about ubiquitous language. And I think they got it from domain-driven design, from Eric, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what I've also seen, and maybe you're going to cry now, is that people think it's a DSL. So they use Cucumber to create these sort of sentences that will relate to code, that will relate to sort of automatic step eventually, right? And and I think that relates again to what you just said, is it's not about the ubiquitous language is in between the people, but not in the Cucumber automation. That's not the end goal. Do you know what I'm getting at there?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not the end goal. I think maybe if we dial back a bit, one of the classics of Cucumber history is the web steps that were originally released, or I don't know if it was originally released. They existed in the early days of Cucumber Ruby, and it was a DSL for interacting with a web browser, and it confused a lot of people because they still ask, does Cucumber support web applications? Which is, it's a question that has no real answer. Cucumber doesn't know anything about any application. All Cucumber does is read a feature file, and in response to what it sees, it tries to find a code function to call. That's all Cucumber knows about. And so ASLAC created web steps to try and help people who were doing end-to-end automation, and discovered that give people a helping hand to do some test automation. They forget about the actual goal of what they're trying to do and rush headlong into really nasty, messy automation. And some years later, he deprecated and withdrew the web steps and wrote a blog post, which actually, Matt, you were talking about just last week.
I just put it in the chat, actually.
Training wheels.
Oh, it's just gone to all panelists, so that's no use to everyone, is it?
No, it's not. So it was, the idea that Cucumber has anything about DSLs is unfortunate. What the Ubiquitous Language is about ensuring that the people who are building the system and the people who are demanding the system have a shared language that they can talk about, so they don't have to keep on translating and losing meaning as they go from one group of functions to another group of functions. DSLs may come out of that, but that's not the purpose.
Yeah, and that's always the thing you just said, Matt, right? We're doing the things in reverse.
Yeah. So it definitely, like this pattern, and so like to kind of be clear about what you're saying. What I see is where people have scenarios that say things like, given I have clicked on log in and I have filled in username with Matt and I have filled in password with Fubar and I have clicked the login button. And I mean, some of these even have like the CSS selectors for the thing in the specification, right? So it's not a specification anymore. It's just a test script. And this is another kind of misappropriation of Cucumber, is where people look at it and think, oh, Gherkin looks like a good language for people who can't write code to write automation scripts. And, you know, it's okay for that, I guess, but I'm pretty sure there are better tools for that. And that's what we end up with, again, is people kind of using it for something which is going to end up becoming unmaintainable and missing out. You know, they're getting a fraction of the benefits that those of us that use it differently and use it as more part of a more kind of coordinated, cohesive team effort will see. Yeah. So it does make us quite sad.
And if you actually Google behavior driven development examples and you go to the pictures, this is the first thing you see. Actually, I am logged into the system as blah blah blah. I update my language to blah blah blah. Right. That's
when we get to talking about modeling later, and I know there's going to be folks that listen to this show that understand about hexagonal architectures and those kind of concepts. Like, when we can write the scenarios at the level of abstraction where you could plug them in, they would make sense if you plug them in through the UI, but also straight to the core domain model. And, you know, if you had some kind of different UI later, like you had a voice UI, they would still be true. You wouldn't have to change them because they're not coupled to some detail about how the user interacts with that particular interface. That's when you know you've got them right.
Yeah, well, so Liz Keogh talks about pixies, right? You should write your scenarios in a way that if the UI was pixies that did all the magic for you, it would still make sense. And I love that, because no one can automate pixies.
And you wouldn't mention pixies in your scenarios because that'd be ridiculous. You'd get fired for being silly.
So what you're actually saying, and maybe we can go on to that later, is would you say that one of these examples you write down could be a port or inside your ports adapters or hexagonal architecture? Or would
one of the examples the examples would exercise a port? So, or they might interact with multiple ports, right? So you might use a port in the given to set up some state, but the idea is that you would be able to plug in those scenarios into one of your ports, just the same as you would plug in a user interface.
Yeah, because it reminds me that the port should be sort of like user behavior named, right? Something that not something like blah 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 server, but it should be a something that the user actually would come up with. It's just a brain fart idea. It was just
yeah. So you instead of using the word service on the end of everything, or factory or service
Yeah.
factory, abstract service factory.
Yeah, exactly. You're a Java programmer or not?
No, I just remember that Steve Yegge Kingdom of Nouns article was always very funny.
Yeah. So,
but going back to this thing about modeling, though, it's just important to dwell on this for a minute, because you mentioned ubiquitous language, and the thing we see when people misuse Cucumber as one of these generic DSLs where they pull in a library that can click buttons and fill in fields. The language they have to use with those DSL libraries is necessarily completely generic. So there's no words in those scenarios that are interesting or relevant to that particular project. You'd see them in any project that has buttons and fields to be filled in. So it's when we get people to change the abstraction level and talk much more about what is the intent of the user, what are they trying to do, rather than how are they doing it on the user interface, then the words that they'll use in the scenario will be the words that we'll see down the stack as we get into the code base. And we start to see that ubiquitous language, because the verbs that we'll see in the when steps can become the names of the commands that are being executed and pushed into the domain, and so on. So getting that language level right is important for us to then be able to use it as a sort of a design tool.
Cash got a useful, interesting way of describing it. He talks about the difference between illustrative and mechanistic. So trying to avoid mechanistic, how the user is going to, what they're going to do, rather than use language that illustrates why they're doing it or what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, so, and the old one we used to say was imperative versus declarative. So the imperative would be like the mechanistic.
That's also in Aslak's blog post, I think.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. So I got one question there that reminds me of some of my event storming sessions in the past, and I also do example mapping, both of them, where during event storming, I also try to be more on the behavior side. But we have so many domain experts who are into the system with their mind. The only thing they can see is either UIs or databases. So sometimes to unlock them out of that blockage that it's about, it's not about that it's about intention versus implementation, I let them write down a UI or a UX mockup to make it somewhat easier for them. Is that something you see happening as well? Is that people cannot get into that behavior mode, but really need to see some form of UI or some form of thing they are interacting with? Is this something you see as well? Because it's usually the discussion, right? When are you going to introduce mockups, for instance?
It depends on who you're working with, doesn't it? So some people are going to want to do things very visually. There's when you start off with a group of people who are not used to working in this way, they always have some issues conceiving them, but conceptualizing how to describe behaviors without talking about UIs or talking about a database field in a table. And I try not, I guess, to introduce them to UI mockups. More, I will try give them examples and see whether they can then, another one of Liz Keogh's great insights is that once you get an example, and then you can change the context and think about what other contexts would lead to the same outcome, and what actions might lead to different outcomes from the given context. And so if you give them one good or one exemplar of an example in their domain, then they can use variations of the steps within it to practice in that space. To be honest, I haven't found that it takes very long for people to actually grasp that we're not talking about the UI. We're talking about what are we trying to achieve? What's the business value? Because the business value is not the fact that there's a button that you can click. Well, unless that is what you're trying to do. But
in clicking factory.
Yeah, exactly. In general, you're trying to achieve something, whether it's playing a game or working out how you're going to become the next great billionaire. And the UI is an irrelevance. And typically.
Yeah, I think so. I think the thing I'd say is it's discovery. Like writing scenarios is discovery. You do it because you're not certain what you want the system to do, and so you try and talk about that and thrash it out, and then you write the scenarios down to sort of consolidate what you've decided or what you think you've decided or what you think you've understood. And depending on what it is that you're discovering, you might also want to have some pictures to accompany that, to help you to visualize. Because the thing about examples is they illustrate it, they bring it to life, and they bring stuff that is currently fuzzy and uncertain to life. And so do pictures. Pictures can be really helpful for that as well. So they can provide you with more context to think about, how's this scenario going to play out? What other scenarios might there need to be? But it really depends, doesn't it? Because like if you've already got a user interface for pricing insurance quotes, and you come up with some new type of insurance policy that's got some different rules, you probably don't need to think about the UI, because the UI is going to be just the same. Maybe there's a new field on there that asks somebody how old their pet is or whatever. But basically it's the same UI, but you've got different rules for how you price it. And all you need to do is just think about the logic, right? And the reasoning, and then text is fine for that, or a table. But if it's new functionality and the lack of visualization of the UI gets in the way of people being able to make it real in their heads and think about it, then you're going to need that as well. So it depends.
Yeah. I've dealt with a couple of these user-centric projects where they go all right, user interface. We need to talk about the user, and then it's hard to unblock people from seeing a mobile app, right? How does this work in a mobile app? Wow. I always say that's really interesting, and that's on itself, of course, UX side is hard, but how do we support that part on a domain model level, right? So it's really hard to sometimes explain that to people who don't grasp the world of software modeling.
One of the ways I've seen it help, like put the light bulbs on for people, is when they've worked in a process where they're quite used to dealing with UX mockups. So we have some people who go and talk to users and dream up a new screen or two, and then they draw beautiful pixels in Photoshop, and then they give that to the team. And this becomes kind of then the team's blueprint for, right, this is what we've got to build now. We've got to build some new screens that look like this. And then the team have to kind of figure out how that screen is going to actually come to life. And the scenarios are where you can bridge between like these static images of here's a screen, here's how it's going to look, to this is how it's actually going to work. This is how it's going to behave. This is going to transition from looking like this to looking like this. This is what happens when you press the settings dialog and you change your notification. You start to think about how you're going to actually interact with it. So teams who are used to being handed mock-ups and then trying to figure out for themselves what the actual behavior is going to be, scenarios can be a helpful way for them to start communicating back with people who in UX who probably have thought a lot about what the users want to do, but don't really get to communicate it very effectively through Photoshop. They can start to have those conversations at the right level. Yeah.
Okay, so we kept saying scenario. Now I want to bring it a bit back to, or bring it to DDD, right? The software modeling. I always take the Model Exploration Whirlpool by Eric Evans as a guideline, usually how to do it. And the first part, I always see it relates a bit to the BDD cycle, which is discovery, formalization, automation. And in Eric Evans' Model Exploration Whirlpool, scenario, model, and code prod. Looks a bit, for me, it has a relationship. Never seen, do you ever saw that Model Exploration Whirlpool?
Yeah, I've seen the books. I've read the diagrams. I haven't ever used. I've never used DDD in anger, and sorry to say, Eric, but I've had struggles using the Model Exploration Whirlpool. It's not a metaphor that has ever I've ever really got my head around.
And what so for me it really relates to the same thing that that you do in BDD, right? The first is discovery. I just use in the scenario part, I use event storming and example mapping to get my head around examples. So a big thing what Eric talks about here is, right, tell a story, be concrete and specific. So that kind of relates to what you do in the BDD process, right?
For sure.
But I guess the focus would be more on. So I'm trying to wrap my head around the relationship between the two, and the focus to, because in example mapping you say tell a story, be concrete and specific, but it mostly is a different perception than when you go to example mapping or event storming. Do you see that same different perception in these two tools once you use that for the first phase? Or
well, so we don't use example mapping for the first phase, as we try and keep reiterating that it's not phases as such, it's stages that each small increment goes through. So there's not a single discovery phase that we then proceed out of. Each story starts off typically as something largish that's not that well understood, and as it goes through, as people discuss it and it gets broken down into manageable chunks, might do example mapping on it, and we then find that it's actually still bigger than we want it to be and split into. And at the same time, there'll be other big pieces of functionality that need to be discussed. And so there's always a range of increments at different levels of different granularities and different levels of understoodness. That's not a word, is it? But that you're going through discovery, and then when you're bringing it into an iteration, or you're about to start some work on it, then at that point you may get some people from the team to take the concrete examples and write scenarios, and now we're talking about driving out actual code. I've never tried to, I read about the model exploration whirlpool a few years ago, and I've never sat them down side by side and tried to draw parallels between them. So I think you have the advantage, certainly on me here, and possibly on Steve and Matt as well, although I wouldn't want to speak for them.
Yeah. So the thing I try to, I hear you say we do example mapping later on. So I also see the BDD cycle as something that it's highly iterative, right? It's not but you say I do example mapping later on. So when you get a big chunk from the user story, from the backlog as a user story.
I don't remember saying it later on. If I said later on, I thought so. Context.
Yeah, well, I thought you said that, and my eyebrows went up when he said it.
Well, there you go. We do example mapping as we bring, as we bring stories to a size where we want to start analyzing them and breaking them apart. Then we will use example mapping, and that will then generate more stories, go back into the backlog and get prioritized.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at it for the first time, and on the face of it, it looks very similar in terms of the sort of diverge, converge kind of design thinking idea. In that, I think scenario is about diverging and looking for things that you might not have seen before. I like that it says leave most ideas behind. It sounds quite messy. And then model is more converge, where we sort of try and, we talk about adding rigor, putting down what we think we've learned from the early part, which sounds a lot like formulation, trying to write things down as scenarios that we've discussed. And then code probe sounds a lot like automation. And automation's a word we kind of feel some discomfort about as far as a term, because I mean, what we mean is test-driven development in that last piece in general. But it might be quite messy test-driven development, because if you're working in the early part of a project with an acceptance test to guide you, there's quite a lot of room for you to sort of write different kinds of code. So it can feel a bit like like probing, I think. Yeah, so there's a lot of similarity. It strikes me that the model exploration whirlpool might be biting off a bigger chunk, maybe. I mean, certainly when I think about something like event storming, when I've used that on what's then turned out to be a series of user stories in terms of planning and delivery of stuff. And we'd really tend to think about using BDD on individual user stories to make sure we've really nailed down the detail of what's going to be implemented for each of those. And where those stories come from is kind of outside of the scope. Like we would see people using other techniques like event storming or impact mapping or whatever to come up with those.
Yeah, I think of example mapping as kind of happening, if you're using Scrum, like in the sprint or in the sprint just before you're going to work on that story. And yeah, I've had the same experience, Matt, where I think event storming I tend to look at and think as like a bigger section, like something we're going to work on over multiple sprints, if you like, or user stories.
Yeah, and that's how what I've written about how I use them. I will start with event storming, and then pick the in event storming you have the business rule. When you go lower, they call it aggregates. I don't like to call them aggregates at that point. I just like to call them business rules, and I just pick them out to do on these business rules and convert it to a business rule in example mapping, and from there try to switch the story. So what I usually say is, once you do an event storm, there's so much you're missing because it has blind spots. And then when you switch the tool and talk in a different way or think in a different way, it will come up with more scenarios. And that's exactly what for me in the part is in scenario. What I'm struggling with myself is once you get these examples out and let's say we formalize them, for me, a model is an abstraction of reality. It's an implementation. I'm not sure if you can say implementation. I guess so. Would your formalized scenarios change on the way your model changes? So if your model changes because you find a better effective way to solve your problem, would your scenarios change? Or is that a sign that your formalized examples are too much intention detail and not, or I mean too much implementation detail and not intention detail? Do you know where I'm getting at here?
Yeah,
so that's the part I'm struggling with.
So if the model changes and the behavior changes, or if the model changes and the behavior doesn't change, that they both can happen, right?
Yeah, so if the behavior changes, you probably adjust your model, of course, but your examples would change.
Right.
But if your examples doesn't change, you can still change your model, but a model change wouldn't be necessarily changing your scenarios.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect to see the scenarios change based on an implementation detail. I think that would be surprising.
It depends on. So, for example, you would expect if you change the name in the model of a widget, if you stopped calling them widgets and started calling them cabodulators, you would expect to see the scenario change to reflect that naming, right? Or if the action that you were taking on the widgets was different, had a different name, you would expect to see that change in the scenario. So I think it depends what of your model is surfaced to the outside of the system, right? Because the scenario is going to be connecting at some level of outside of the system. So it depends on whether the model changes is, as Seb says, an implementation detail, or whether it's kind of in the public types and interface of your core domain model. In which case you probably would expect to see it in the scenarios on some level. I mean, one of the things that can change scenarios, for example, is when you make things asynchronous, and you might need to have something that in the scenarios that explicitly says, and when the such and such has synchronized, you might need to describe that as part of telling the story, because that's how the system now works. You have to wait for some things to finish, some queue to drain down before it's a good time to carry on to the assertion part of the test. And actually, when you're telling the story of the scenario, that becomes part of the description, and that might reflect a change you've made in your model.
So there's something interesting you say there about system, right? You say if we are doing it async, the examples would change. But with that technical detail, wouldn't that be eventually an intention of the system? Do you know what I'm getting at?
Maybe not. Maybe not. It was an example I just pulled out of the air to sort of try and suggest something that might change in your implementation details that you might want to reflect in the scenarios to sort of more accurately describe how the system's behaving from the outside. But it's a maybe not that one. I don't know. Has anyone else got a better example?
Well, I think Eric says here it's he loves the asynchronous point. It can it can drive total redesign and remodeling, right? But I usually also in event storming, where people want to cut down more on, let's say, business invariance, right? A business invariant where this needs to stay in a consistent state. And now you're already flexing in sort of like implementation with intention a bit, but then again, you're not, because how far can I cut down the business invariance until the business still finds it okay that certain things are out of state? For instance, a concrete example we always give with the cinema. So cinema booking. Let's say you have on one hand tickets and you have on one hand reserved seats. So one problem is, okay, which seats can I book? And on the other side, which tickets have I already given out? So would the business be okay with these two being out of sync for a short period, right? Where you say, I'll free up a certain seat, but that ticket will still be assigned to a certain person at that time. Would that be okay or not? Do you know where I'm getting at a bit here? And that's where during modeling, I always get in. That's actually a business conversation you're having. Also, why do you want to model towards asynchronous? Is there a specific business need behind it?
So I think I probably disagree somewhat with Matt in the sense that I would expect changes to flow from the business discussion down through the scenario to then, we've got to change our implementation model. I completely accept that there will be situations where somebody finds something, some implementation constraint, forces them to go back to the business and say, look, we'd really like to talk about this again, and now let's discuss new examples and maybe change some of the terminology. But I certainly would like in the world this to be the exception rather than the rule. Typically, I see things flowing in the other direction. You work through the discovery process by collaborating. You use examples to ensure that you've surfaced as many of those misunderstandings as possible. Then you formulate those examples using and develop your ubiquitous language. And at that point, the implementation, it's in the technical domain. I very rarely want to go back to a business person and say, do you mind if I make this asynchronous? I don't think, that's not... It's
not about, do you mind if I make this asynchronous? It might be, when we reserve tickets, we have to do it through this external system and the API calls take 5 seconds. And so we can enter a situation where two people try and reserve a ticket and actually only one of them is going to end up buying the ticket.
And then at that point...
in that situation, right? Yeah. So we've discovered something technical. And then the scenario starts to feed back up.
Yeah. We've got a new business rule. We've got a new business rule.
Absolutely. But so that's an example where it's not just always sort of a top-down flow where the business tells us what to put in the gherkin and then we just code up whatever's in the gherkin. Sometimes we get down to writing the code and then we go, oh shit, it's going to take 5 seconds to make this request. Actually, we're going to have to do this out of band. That means we're going to need some new scenarios and the feedback goes back up the other way. Yeah. And then we have to say, look, what are we going to do in this? Well, yeah. Yeah.
But that
But
is
it's not just legacy software. You know, we discover stuff all the way down until we've written all the if statements. We're going to keep learning.
so that's what happens at example mapping. At example mapping, the technical team are coming up with examples to say, what would you want to happen in this situation? And what you're saying is that actually we missed something in example mapping. We didn't realize that there was this technical constraint in this part of the system. We have to go back to the example mapping or some other form of discovery and have the conversation. But it's not that it's flowing back up as such. It's just that we didn't ask the right questions. We didn't have enough knowledge. We've learned something new, and we have to go back and carry on from where we started. But it's not what I frequently see people do at clients is they go, well, we formulated these scenarios and now it goes over to the developers, and if the developers want to change them to make the automation easier, that's fine.
We've got
to say the specification is owned by the business people. It's got to fit in with the constraints of the technical domain, and if we discover new constraints, then clearly we have to discuss them. But it's written business readable language, and it's owned by the product owner.
So you can see how strongly Seb feels about this, and like that point of view that where there's this almost sort of passive aggressive behavior from the technical team where they just go like, oh yeah, I know the business people said this, but it's going to be much easier for me to automate it if I just change it to read like this, and I'm sure that'll be fine. And then it becomes this unreadable stuff that isn't you lose your domain experts if you change the acceptance test, like you stop using their language and start using other words. It definitely loses a connection with them. Equally, though, it is really important that what's in those scenarios honestly reflect what's down in the code. So if the business people call it a widget, right, and then you've just gone and called it a collection item in your code base, and you've got this ugly mapping somewhere, that's dishonest is the word I was going to use. It sounds a bit moralistic, but you're not adhering to that lovely ubiquitous language principle, and you're going to have glitches in there that are either in your conversations or in the code that you're writing. So that's why this stuff is so fascinating, because the scenarios become this kind of crucible where, if you want to keep the business people on side, you've got to keep writing them the way they want them written, but you also want to make sure that they honestly reflect what is down in the code. And if you can see that they don't, or you can see that the business people don't like reading or writing them, you can see that now that your code and the way that the people who talk about and care about the system think, then you haven't got a good model.
Yeah, and that's also a good point there. A few things I always see is what just got mentioned, right? It's a technical spec that the developers need to implement. That's one thing I always see failing. So that's already a smell, I can imagine. But we never know for sure once we start to probe the implementation if we were correct. You can lower that amount, I think.
Yeah.
But as soon as you put it in code, you can still think, oh, crap.
Yeah.
This impacts the way we thought about this. And another smell for me is usually when technical people can tell you what's the fault. So like, it's a DDoS attack or performance-wise. So they can tell you the technical fault, but they cannot tell you the impact on the business it's having.
Yeah.
So for me, that's also a smell that its feedback loop of ubiquitous language isn't there yet. Do you understand what I'm saying there?
Yeah.
And yeah. So let's see if we got some questions.
There was just on that ubiquitous language thing. One of the things that I think Matt alluded to earlier, where we struggle with the word automation of the BDD practice, because what we mean is, test-driven development, acceptance test-driven development, whatever you want to call it. But one of the advantages of doing that, of writing those scenarios first and then using them to drive the code, is that business language that you've written that specification in naturally flows down into the code that you write in the system, because you're using those words to help you build the development. And that is one of the key parts of it for me, that helps you get that thread run all the way through from the discovery sessions maybe even the model that you build in event storming and the words that you use there right the way through to the code, because you're writing those executable specifications in the business language.
Yeah. Two things, two from Eric. The first one is, as you are writing BDD stories, you have to use specific words with certain meanings. So you are doing a level of modeling there. Second one, what we were already into, right? It's the feedback loop, Seb, and you said we didn't ask the right question, and that's Eric says, and maybe you agree or disagree. I would like to know. It biases us strongly towards the one directional. If you say we didn't ask the right questions, what do you think of that point? I think it's really strong, right?
I'm not sure. Maybe I don't understand it. I'm essentially, as I said right at the beginning of this session, I see BDD as a collaboration process.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying. Okay, so Eric's knowledge should flow from implementation experience also. Absolutely. So, but it's not. I think it is the point about having a collaborative session when we talk about the three amigos, where there's a representative from test, development, and the business or product, is so that you get different experiences, different viewpoints represented. And so it's not unidirectional in any situation. And I think what we're talking about here is that even having been through discovery, we're not always done. And any one of those three, or anyone who is part of the development process, can say, oh, I forgot to ask this question, or this viewpoint wasn't being represented at the discovery session. We need to get back and talk about it. So for instance, most example mapping sessions that I've been to don't have anyone from the security team at them, but quite often late in the development process, security becomes a serious issue. You mentioned DDoS there earlier. So then you have to come back and see how that affects models, implementations, specifications, and you may end up with new scenarios.
Yeah, and that comes to one of the questions that always pops into my mind, especially when going to customers. A lot of customers are still in this unidirectional way of building code as a factory, right? I think John Cutler made a brilliant post about that. When are you in an IT factory? So would you say, should we fix that first before you actually start doing BDD and DDD?
Yeah, probably. I mean, we've ended up like peeling back the layers of the onion quite often when we've gone on a consulting project, and we don't really do that so much anymore, but that was our bread and butter work for quite a few years. And someone would pick up the phone to us and say, hey, we want to teach our QA people how to use Cucumber to automate tests, and we just say, nope, we're not doing that, but can we talk to the whole team? And and then we'd go in and do a training with the whole team, including the product management, and then we'd discover that actually there were systemic issues in the organization that were preventing them from being able to collaborate effectively. And so we'd say, well, can we talk to the head of IT or the CTO or whoever and sit down with them? And you end up kind of peeling back the layers, because you realize that the context that would make these things possible just isn't there. And if people are willing to listen, it can be quite interesting, but it's also quite soul sapping, really, when you come into an organization and you can see that they're not ready for these ideas, and they're going to be adopting a small fraction of the practice and a small fraction, and getting a small fraction of the benefits, and they're just not ready to hear about some of the other ideas. It can be frustrating.
Yeah. And would you say not even frustration, but actually dangerous to actually start using BDD or DDD without these layers being peeled off? As in, wouldn't you just go and have people write BDD scripts as a technical team, giving the business and giving the teams the illusion that they're doing BDD effectively? Actually, in the long run, like 6 months later on, it actually does more worse. And then, well,
If that's where they start, if they start by writing given when then and trying to automate it, then it can cause more problems than it's worth. But if they start with doing something like example mapping just as a way to understand the work that they're about to do and think about those examples, even if they don't write them as given when then, even if they don't go on and automate them, if they just have them in their head as the way they want the system to work, I think that can add tremendous value to any development team.
Yeah, and that's still the what Alberto calls, it's an order of magnitude harder to refute bullshit. So if people say we're doing BDD because we're using Cucumber, only that, right? And the business thinks they're using BDD, it's harder to refute that that's not actually BDD, especially 6 months later, which is a shame. So sometimes I'm just too early in a company and they already decided to do DDD while they're not ready for it. Well, I think it's a fair point to say, well, let's not go into there first.
A question for you, Kenny. What do you say in a place like that, where if you think they're ready, like let's say sort of psychologically, like they're somebody there gets it, maybe they used to have successful DDD adoption in their previous company and they've come in and they want to make it happen in this new company, but they've got legacy code. What do you tell them? Like, is it a good time for them to start doing that right now in their legacy code base? What?
I think there's a very good intention to start doing it. The only thing that needs to be there is collaboration. Sometimes they even start with the team and just do an event storm on their legacy system. So process event storming, see how their legacy system works. And if I do notice that they use a lot of technical terms in there, then you're going to start peeling off the layers, right? But I will tell them up ahead that first, especially on, and it sounds a bit like legacy is bad, but it's not. Let's first find out what this legacy actually is doing right, because it's still there. It's still working.
Yeah, it's making you money. Yeah.
I've worked on legacy for 7 years where every time they say, well, we need to redo this. Well, I say, why? What's actually your business case of doing it again? And then just start seeing, okay, where do you want to add value where you cannot add value now? So it's really about, I like to start with the conversation first, and it doesn't matter on which level, but focus on business terms instead of technical terms.
Yeah,
I think the
place we struggle with in a legacy context is if you're going to go to the rigor of expressing your model in Gherkin, you know, you're going to some version of your model in Gherkin. It's only really worth doing that if you are going to automate it and check it, because if we've seen places where they've written lots and lots of it, but they don't know whether it's true or not because they're not testing it. And, you know, it just ends up like another crap requirements document that may or may not be out of date. So you need to go to the work of automating it. But then the question becomes like, how automatable is your system? And, you know, and ideally, you're going to be doing those tests first. You're going to be taking a scenario for the new behavior that you want or the bug that you want to fix. You're going to wire it up to the system. It's going to fail. And then you're going to fiddle around with the system until it goes green.
Yeah.
But if that bit of then you wire it up to the system takes you days because it's really hard to do because the system was just not designed for it. Or maybe, you know, it's almost even impossible. Or every time you want to run the test, it takes 30 seconds because you've got to wait for something to boot. It becomes a really hard environment for those people to learn this new practice because they're trying to play soccer and they're dropped into playing in the Champions League. You know, it's a really, really hard environment to be using that skill in. And actually what they need is a nice greenfield project to play with it on, where it's sort of small and contained.
Yeah, and that's always the trade-off I have if I give workshops in DDD or BDD. Is do you get their domain with a chance of it's Champions League level? Now you need to learn something new. Or do you give them the fake domain and then they go back to the Champions League and think, huh, what's going on here? Yeah, that's something.
It's always a mental challenge trying to understand someone else's domain in a 1 or 2 day window. Yeah.
Well, often they don't understand it. So one of our US clients, I spent a whole day with them going, well, you just have to instantiate this subject. They go, yeah, I don't know how we instantiate this subject. Do you use it? Yeah, all the time. Well, where does it come from? I don't know. Somewhere in the plumbing of the build, somewhere this object gets instantiated with all of its dependencies and a reference gets handed to them. Yeah, it's a nightmare. I think it's out of date and obviously well respected. But if you remember reading Michael Feather's book on working effectively with legacy code, and I think it's during the introduction he talks about the years that he spent painfully on client sites, working, trying to place them under test. And that book, it's full of the pain that he went through, learning the art. And unfortunately, it doesn't get faster. So if you speak to Michael about it, he won't say that, now it's really easy. You've got the book, you go in, you apply the patterns, everything's finished. The patterns are the tools that you need to help refactor an application so that you can place it under test. But that piece of work is painstaking. It's a bit like the archaeology, can't remember, Code as a Crime Scene, who wrote that one. Anyway, it's a painstaking piece of work, trying to refactor it. And the de facto default way that teams who try and apply BDD to large untestable systems is that they end up testing the whole bloody system. They test it through the user interface. They end up totally locked into known data in the database or at the back end, or they just go, oh, it's too hard. And at that point you get into maintenance nightmare, where I've had some clients who've had whole teams whose only job is to come in every morning and get the BDDs to work again, because every night the BDDs break, and it's not delivering any value to anybody.
It's probably a tangent, but this idea that a different team can manage the tests of another system is a huge problem, right? Because to make a system testable, you have to be able to change the system, right? You need that feedback to build that testable system the whole time. And if it's different teams doing it, there's a great big communication barrier between them, and the code bases are separate code bases effectively.
Yeah, and over there you say a system. I think I'd rather be dealing with a big monolith legacy system than 20 services that has end-to-end BDD tests that fail every night, because they're probably misaligned with the way the business actually thinks it is. So how can you decouple all these small services with proper BDD examples around them towards hopefully a ports and adapter architecture there? That's hard. It takes a lot of effort to do that.
So this is an interesting thing you talk about, carving up some behavior across a bunch of microservices, and we quite often get asked when we deal with a team that are using microservices, like, where do I put the feature files? Where do I, because I want to describe the behavior across, like you say, like an end-to-end test across several of the services. And the question becomes, why can't you describe the behavior of these individual services in a way that would make sense to some domain expert? Like, why is the allocation of responsibility to one of those services not something that, because effectively those services are your model, right? Or they're part of your model. It's just that the objects are really unwieldy, and the protocols with which they communicate are slow. But it's, if the way you've allocated the responsibilities across those services has come from the solution domain rather than from the problem domain, you might need to think about that. if it isn't easy to say, you know, this is the set of behaviors, those behaviors that you want, dear domain expert, well, you just have to go and look for them over here in this service, because that's what its job is, to do those things.
Yeah.
If you can't have that conversation, there's probably something wrong with the way you've allocated the responsibilities across the services.
Yeah, for me, it's a social technical misalignment between responsibility and the way you implemented your models. For me, an end-to-end test is how Steve Smith says it's continuous. You cannot do continuous delivery with end-to-end testing over multiple systems. It doesn't compute, and I agree with that. That's a smell that you're actually not creating autonomous, aligned software there. So, but you do have these big enterprise organizations that do have it now, and it's hard to deal with peeling that off than it is a big monolith system, I think. But it's been already more than an hour. I want to finish up some questions. First question, and Seb already replied here, is from Nick. What's the future of BDD? What's going to be different 5 years from now? Seb, you said, I hope the future of BDD is slow expansion, just as TDD. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, yeah, I guess I hope it's fast expansion, but the reality is that as one of our clients, Shita Patel, said at QConfest a number of years ago, BDD is more of a shift of mindset than just applying a few random toolings or patterns. And changing people's mindset, especially changing the mindset of organizations, is a slow business. Earlier on, Piotr, I used one of my favorite George Bernard Shaw quotes, which is the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And last weekend I was reading the paper and I discovered someone was writing about a quote from Max Planck, which I hope no one gets too offended, but it gets distilled down to progress in science happens one funeral at a time. And unfortunately, I think BDD might be, and TDD might be a bit like that, in the sense that the systems that we've got at the moment are very difficult to apply TDD to, because they are tightly coupled. They are highly bound to the user interfaces and the various technologies of persistence. And it's as those systems get replaced, incrementally by systems that are more amenable to automation, as people come into the software industry who are more attuned to the idea that automation is not just possible, but desirable. I believe we will see an increase of this. We will see a continued increase of these attitudes to software development and software architecture. And that's what I mean by slow expansion. I mean, TDD's been around for decades. There's a lot of people who will tell you that they do TDD and they don't. There are a lot of people who say they do unit testing and they're not. But I still see an upward trend. It's just it's a depressingly slow upward trend.
Yep. Steve, Matt, what's your take on that?
I think for me, yeah, I mean, the future of BDD, I don't think is that going to be that different. It's going to be using key examples of system behavior to drive how we build it. I think what might change is how we discuss those examples and how we're able to codify them. At the moment, given when then is probably the most popular way of doing it, with some table support. Fit, there's still places using fit and fitness, using table driven stuff, but I think we'll gain better tools for being able to describe those examples in a way that helps people understand them, and the way we're then able to automate them. There was a great lightning talk, I think, at QCup a couple of years ago by Kieran McNulty, where they were doing BDD effectively, but the tool they were using to describe their examples was GraphViz scripts. So they had pictures of the flow that they wanted, the workflow that they wanted, because it was a very workflow driven tool. and they were automating those as examples. And I think it's those are the kind of things that we're going to see more of in as BDD continues to grow.
Yeah. So I've got sort of two thoughts about it. I mean, the maturity curve that Seb talked about is really interesting to me. So yeah, in 5 years, I guess I would be hopeful that we've turned something of a corner in terms of how aware people are of what's beneficial. Do you want to see all the people? Come and say hello. No. Okay, good night. More people are more aware of when this is a valuable tool. And one of the things I think is interesting that happens when teams practice these things, and I'd imagine DDD, I've never really been on a team that was wholeheartedly doing DDD, but I imagine it's the same sort of thing, that you get a much tighter relationship between the people who want the code, have got the money, and the people who can deliver the code. And that tighter relationship leads to all kinds of good decisions about, we've got some idea that we want to test, so let's write some really scrappy code and get something out quickly and test it, versus we've got something that's definitely a winner and we want it to be rock solid and we're going to really invest heavily in making it a great technical solution, versus even like, we've realized that this feature here is not getting us good value for money versus the maintenance cost. Let's rip it out of the code base. Right? How often do teams really do that? So that kind of tight relationship between business and technology, I'd hope to see more of that, so that we know when to apply that rigor, when to put that real effort in and when to not. But I think the other thing, sort of thinking more specifically about BDD and kind of what Steve was talking about a bit there, about, so we talk a lot of, one of the powerful things I think about example mapping is that we help people to think about the clear distinction between what's a rule or a property of the system and what is an example of that property, right? Because what we want to have in the code is not the examples, right? We don't want to have a bunch of switch statements or if statements in the code. We want to have the rules in the code. We want to have a model. But the examples are a really good way to get us to the rule, so that we know what to put into the model. But if you look at say Nat Price is a good person to follow for reading about this stuff, the guy that wrote, or one of the co-authors of Growing Object-Oriented Software Guided by Tests. Nat talks a lot these days about property-based testing. So using rules to generate N examples for your automated tests. And I think that's something that when Steve's talking about, what are some other ways of expressing the specifications for the system or the examples, that's something I'd be hopeful that we could start to do, is to be able to express a property of the system and just generate tests, generate examples, rather than necessarily, once we've had the conversations where examples have been helpful for us to discover the rule, we can then just express a rule and have the system, have the tests to check that rule for us in its entirety, rather than just a few examples that we've picked by hand by humans.
Cool. Thanks. There's still tons of questions. Do you mind going on and answer a few more?
I thought we were running till the hour, weren't we?
Yeah. So we can go. Well, let's do one more here, or two more. One is from Rebecca saying, do you have a similar BDD style strangler pattern or equivalent for refactoring? Seb already answered there with the same strangler pattern. BDD is, from an automation perspective, no different to applying TDD. Anyone else has a take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just important when you're expressing the acceptance tests to stay abstract of where they happen to be connected today. So maybe it is necessary to connect right at the outside and punch buttons in a browser and squirt data into a database to test the system as a big lump today. But if you write the scenarios in a language that allows you to later connect at a deeper seam, more around the model, then great. So you want to try and have that flexibility in the acceptance test so that you could do that. But apart from that, I think it's just the same as how you'd be doing it, whether if you were using a different type of acceptance testing or testing. I suppose maybe the other thing to point out that's an obvious one is picking defects. Defects can be a really good place to start if you've not got tests around the system. If you're dealing with a really grotty old legacy system, starting with defects is a good place to start practicing TDD, because they tend to be quite a contained fix. They tend to come with an example.
Yeah. Anything to add, Steve? Seb, there for that part?
No.
Okay. So I like to finish off with one question that I think is on a lot of people's mind, where we're talking about communication, collaboration, but most of us are sitting at home. So do you have to finish off today? It's a question by Nick. Do you have, how do you optimize remote consulting workshops, and which tools do you use in these times?
So
what are your prime tips?
Yeah, so we did our first fully remote 3-day training course last week. And our training courses have always been, we've always said, no, you've got to do them in person because they're very immersive and there's lots of exercises and we wander around tables. And anyway, so myself and Gashmer Nodge spent a week porting our 3-day training course from ASCII-Doc and PDF to Miro. So Miro, which used to be, what did it used to get called?
Real-time board.
Real-time board. An excellent tool if you've got the computing power in your desktop or your laptop to run multiple boards at the same time. So what we did was we divided the clients into 4 or 5 groups, and we had a board for each of the groups, and each of the exercises that we used to do with pen and paper and walking around the room got translated into a frame within the Miro board, and each of the learning outcomes had a number of frames, and we set people up in breakout rooms, and then went over the exercises in the main room, and then when it's time to do the next exercise, sent them back out into breakout rooms. So it was a mix of Miro for the practical work and Zoom for the communication. And the feedback so far, it was Gashmo that delivered it. The feedback has been excellent. So the tools really worked. And so did Gashmo.
Anyone else?
I wish Miro were paying us for the number of times we recommend them at the moment. I think the other thing I'd recommend, I did a webinar about this for Smart Bear last week, is mob programming. So I did a webinar about how we use remote mob programming. We've been using it on the Cucumber team since like 2015. Rebecca's been on our mob, haven't you? And it works surprisingly well, even in a remote context. It's a bit harder work, like many things are, doing it remotely, but it's also really great that, you know, you don't have to get in a car or get on a train to go to work. But mobbing is a brilliant way to create code together, and you know, you don't just have to use it for programming. You can use it for modeling and requirements workshops and all kinds of things.
And the other tool that we didn't use last week, but I'm a big proponent of, is Cyber Dojo, which is an online development environment designed by John Jagger specifically for teaching test-driven development.
Yeah, let's put a link to that.
Yeah, and we've at Cucumber, we've created our own. It's open source, and so we've got our own instance running with some of our custom training problems in it as well. But yeah, Cyber Dojo is just an amazing group TDD or training environment. It's got all the features you could possibly want, as long as you don't want all the features that developers typically want, which like auto-completion and syntax checking, which that's naughty. You're not allowed that.
I think my final tip for remote collaboration is take more breaks. It's a lot harder than in person.
Cool.
Tip.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. It seems to blur work-life a bit more harsh now. So taking good breaks or staying in your rhythm is actually a good technique. Something we're trying to do is splitting a full day up in maybe 4 sections of 2 hours or 2 sections of 4 hours, which seems to be working a bit better. Cool. Thank you very much for being on our virtual DDD. I hope you enjoyed it.
Very much so, yeah.
Great. So this was it. So I wish everyone a pleasant evening or day or morning or whatever time zone you're watching this or rewatching this. Tomorrow I'll put the podcast online. I'll just one-on-one put it to the podcast. And well, if you have any questions, everyone is actively on Twitter. So let's keep continuing over there. Thank you.